Thank you for staying with Benchmark. A veteran in the tourism industry, in an interview in LMD's March edition, cites the need for professionally trained resources in hospitality if Sri Lanka is to compete with global destinations that have grown qualitatively and quantitatively. Today's traveller demands more than just the Sri Lankan smile. We can't get away with that anymore, he warns. Indeed, mediocre HR is said to lead to an unremarkable service experience, especially given that tourists demand more for less these days. We caught up with Tilak Selvaya, who is an executive consultant at LOLC and also a director and chief operating officer at Brown's Investments, and asked him for his views on the human resources function in Sri Lanka's tourism industry. Welcome to Benchmark, Tilak. Thank you for coming into our studios to talk to us about the tourism industry, especially its HR function. When you look at the tourism industry and the HR function that goes with it, what do you see currently?
I think that what we have as an HR function is something relatively new. It's about a decade old, because we used to call it really personnel management, which was the old term. In tourism, it's very profoundly a very important aspect of our whole industry, because we are dealing with people. And HR is certainly an area of activity which needs attention, not only in terms of finding the correct people, but also having people who are properly both qualified and able academically as well as professionally to be able to manage and perform tasks which are in keeping with the aspirations and expectations of tourists who visit our country. So I see HR as profoundly an important aspect of our industry, and certainly there is a lot more room for development in that area, and that development has to be supported by both the state as well as the private sector.
Speaking of aspirations and expectations, most tourists now are very discerning. In fact, they demand value for money, or probably demand more than what they pay for. So mediocre HR means that it leads to an unremarkable service experience. At the end of the day, it's service that one would remember as you leave a destination, no matter how great and how good or everything else is. So what measures are actually being taken to up our service levels to improve the service standards?
Firstly, before I answer that, let me tell you that tourists who are discerning are on the increase, purely because of the fact that the sun and sea syndrome that we had, sun, sand and sea, which was the syndrome in Sri Lanka, and that has now changed. We are going into areas like ecotourism, adventure tourism, wellness therapies. These are the new trends. So HR again needs to get itself focused on these areas, and the private sector has given cognizance to that very, very seriously, and training is becoming very much an integral part of the everyday survival of let me say people who are doing the job well. The state also has a very serious part to play in that, to the extent that they need to set proper standards, and I think the key word to that ironically is benchmark. So they got to make standards work, and they have to have teeth that bite, just to make sure that tourists who come here get all their aspirations fulfilled.
So Tilak, what sort of institutions are there for an entrant to qualify somebody who wants to get into the hospitality industry? Where do they go and get these qualifications and be employable?
I think the necessity is that youth need to get focused on what their expectations in life are. Are they only mercenary and financial, or is it a career that they are looking at? In the old days, people looked at a career and it became, that was their life. And today, youth are mostly centered on a different focus. They are more money oriented as against career oriented. So I think youth need to have an awareness of really what they can expect. Let's say a guy who has no experience at all, who comes into the hospitality sector, has to start at the very bottom. It's most unlikely that he can become a management trainee unless he has got some kind of professional qualification behind him, or has done some kind of educational program. So they need to face reality. Like we've had great guys in Sri Lanka who reached the very top, who began at the bottom. But unfortunately today, that's not really a practical thing unless you pass 15 to 20 years of service in an organization. A person who joins as a room boy cannot aspire to be a general manager unless he actually physically goes into school and gets the necessary qualifications and the inputs technically to be able to sustain that job. In the old days, with the rest house type of management that we had, people were able to manage, and they brought the kind of management of their homes into rest houses and small guest houses. But today, if you remember the words that we had before, tourists are discerning, so they are talking of more skillful services and expectations which are more, let me say, profound as well as refined. So people need to get focused on that as well before they really get themselves thinking of, I want to be a hotelier. Everybody likes to be a general manager, but to be a general manager you need to have lots of support services around you, both academically, professionally and experience wise, to be able to face the challenges of today's requirement.
But Tilak, now for a long time I would say, and maybe probably it is characteristic of our region, you know, that inherent warm home feeling, the hospitality feeling that you get when visiting our destination specifically, is that being moved away from? Are we becoming more plastic or more commercial, as it may be? That are we losing that inherent warmth that we've been very famous for?
That is very much associated with Sri Lanka as a country, because we are known as a warm, hospitable nation. But we are in 2012. In 2012 we are with IT, we are with plastic credit cards, so the focus has slightly changed. And that may not give you the kind of money that probably people would aspire to have. So that warmth has now become a little more commercial, sadly, but again very practically, because warmth doesn't always generate money, and money is the key at this moment of time. Financially we need to also be viable. That was more a service oriented industry at that time. I'll just digress for a moment to tell you that tourism is the fastest growing industry in the world. It is also the most super sensitive industry, because the moment something happens there is immediate reaction. You can see that the reaction will affect our occupancy and whatever else. So we need to have people who have to give cognizance to the fact that we are in actually a very human industry. We are not a machine industry. So the heads and the people who govern this industry have given cognizance to that, and you need to have people. Sometimes it's difficult to identify people who have that warmth, but you can create a plastic smile. It's possible to do that, but you can't make those actions go with the plastic smile. So answering you specifically, Sri Lanka is a great destination. We've got great people here. I always say that we are a third world country but with first world people. So we need to be proud of that and move towards trying to have our industry govern itself to be a very successful industry.
It's time for some commercials now. When we return, we have more insights from Tilak Selvaya. Welcome back. We now have part 2 of our exclusive interview with Tilak Selvaya. Looking at Sri Lanka currently, there's a lot of brick and mortar development in the hospitality industry, but we need HR to service this hardware. Now, do you think the HR development is happening fast enough to meet the developing hardware status?
Specifically, no, because we are doing brick and mortar development, and our biggest challenge today is actually HR finding the correct people. Now, finding the correct people, if you look at a classic example of what's happening in the East, there are some developments in the Pasiguda and the Trincomalee area, and there are lots of youths there who are very anxious to join our industry. So I think professionals have identified that reason, and they are only able to train people. But the amount of trainers that Sri Lanka has is also limited. Again, specifically on the HR front, our situation has become so bad that we are today hiring expatriates to manage some of our hotels. They are coming in to manage our hotels, plus they are even going to manage the hotels that are being built. Now that is quite ironic, because we have good people in other parts of the world. And why they are not coming back is purely, I'm sure you have a question for me about wages. And that's because our wages are not commensurate to the services that are being granted. So we need to get a proper yardstick on that and get ourselves measured, because we have, if you look at some of the very nice names that are known in hospitality management around the world, we are studded with a series of Sri Lankan people who are holding key portfolios in those organizations. So we need to get them back. At the same time, we need to be able to pay them adequately. So there is a definite issue about wages, and there is definitely an issue about finding correct people who can train.
How important is language in the hospitality industry? How important is English? How important are other languages, the proficiency? We're trying to entice Russia, we're trying to entice Middle Eastern, so we would need Russian, Arabic, and probably Chinese Mandarin as well, since we're trying to attract those markets too. How do we get around this?
I think it is profoundly important. I would specifically mention it profoundly, to the extent that if you cannot communicate, you really have not any chance of winning a successful situation with anyone. English is definitely the link language which we have to develop, and it is quite sad sometimes that people cannot speak the language. Our tourist board and the other organizations also need to insist that where, let's say for example, the front as well as the other areas which have contact with the clients need to definitely have foreign speaking people. I personally speak 5 languages and I'm proud of that, and that has been one of the successes of my life, the fact that I'm oriented towards that. And I think that specifically a linked language is very important, but we today have new trends of, as you mentioned, Russians for example. We don't have many Russian speaking staff. Arabic we don't have, but we need to develop that. Mandarin. China and India are supposed to be the next 2 groups of people who are going to invade our country in terms of tourism, so we have to develop that. The private sector has given cognizance to that, and they seem to be sending their people out for training, but there definitely is a dearth for learning languages and for having people who are competent in being able to talk properly with clients.
Tilak, there is a strong view that cultural tourism and ecotourism will be the strong areas where we can actually build a niche product, given the competitive market that we live in. What would the demands be on HR with this trend of thought?
I'll give you a very classic example which has been spoken of many times before and which I have also had an association with. That is the association with the Kandalama Hotel. When the Kandalama Hotel was built in 1991, 80% of the staff were within 15 kilometers of the precincts of the hotel. And I would say 90% of that 80% were those who were first timers and had never seen a hotel. But Aitken Spence was very smart, and they trained those people. They found young, energetic boys and girls from the area, and they trained them. They first of all made them aware of what the expectations of tourists were, and today they have been professionals. I was very pleased to see 2 days or 3 days ago at the Taj Hotel, one of those young boys who couldn't say good morning, who's today a manager in the Taj, one of the outlets. And that is speaking for itself. This is where the private sector should be going, finding young, energetic people, inspiring them and getting them focused on what is necessary, and we will be able to produce good people thereafter.
You know, you called the tourism industry super sensitive, and you're not far wrong. I mean, look at what's happening in the Maldives and look at what we have experienced for 30 years before. There is a sense of volatility. Could that be the cause of the reluctance of young people to actually enter the fray, wondering, well, whether they would be able to weather the storm at the end of the day?
What has happened in the Maldives and in Sri Lanka is nothing new. It has happened in several other parts of the world. People are today IT sensitive, and everybody carries a cellular phone, and news passes in just seconds. So there is a trend that people feel that tourism may not work if things go wrong. But we have a history of defeating the most ruthless terrorism organization in the world, and we came out of it. And most of us who are living in this country have had the confidence that we can make it. I, for one, am very quite national minded that way, and I'm proud to be Sri Lankan. That's why I'm here, having had the opportunity of living abroad. So we need to give this inspiration to the youth as well. Yes, things may go wrong. The tea prices fall down, but people don't stop plucking tea. Garment factories close up, and then they don't close up again, and they don't give up the industry. So youth need to understand that there is a trend. In the old days, tourism was centered around just the winter season, November to April. That was the period of tourism in Sri Lanka. We had November to April, and then we closed up, and then we had 1 month in July and August. Today we are a 12-month destination. We have places in the east, we have places in the west, and the cultural triangle as well, which is very interesting. So we are blessed actually in that way of having an all-round a year situation with no winter. And we can, in certain parts of the country, we are blessed to be able to have good weather most parts of the year. Now, youth need to understand that, again, like a highway, you don't find, at some times of the night, you don't find heavy traffic. So there will be ups and downs, and it's sometimes a little sensitive because people become a little cautious when they think in terms of there's a coup or there's some problem or the military is overactive. But we have had the confidence to stay on, and I'm sure that they will also find that confidence quite interesting to them in the days to come.
Now to my question of wages and service charge that you brought up a little earlier. Really, Tilak, is it enough just to add on that service charge to a very basic, almost non-working salary and talk about potential earnings to a young aspirant who actually wants to make ends meet? Is this enough?
Again, this is a fairly diplomatic question, and I need to give you a two-pronged answer on that. as a hotelier as well as an entrepreneur in a different form, the wages that are being paid through the wages board, which have been determined, are quite prehistoric. They do not in any way support one to be able to live his life. For example, a room boy or a steward may earn, let's say, between 8 and 10,000 rupees, which makes it impossible for him to live without the service charge. The service charge is really a supplementary income which is dependent on occupancy. So, answering you specifically, those wages are totally inadequate if you look at it in terms of a person's life. Let's say you look at a maid today, you can't, there's no way that you can find a person to work in a house unless you pay 10,000 plus. And service charge is definitely a very, very motivating factor for anyone to get. But what has happened now in the industry is that the service charge has become a part of the salary. So unless you have a proper occupancy which is linked to service charge, the staff become unhappy. So I think with the passage of time, those basic wages will go up. Like it has in the other parts of the industries, in different industries, those wages have come up. And I can see the hotel industry also having wages going to be revised with time.
That was Tilak Selvaya. Coming up after the break, it's the Voice of Business.